Hello, everyone, and good morning. Welcome to the third week of our course, Propaganda and Protest. I'm Ariana Lee, and I'm the Assistant Event Manager of Lectures, Courses, and Concerts. Today's lecture is Artists, Images, and Action, 1960s to 1980s. And please join me in welcoming our speaker, Patricia Berman.
Thank you for that introduction. Everybody laughs when I say I'm working on sun tanning because they think that the research is fun, but it's actually a study of eugenics. Not so much fun. I wanted to first of all thank the Museum of Fine Arts for this opportunity, thank all of you ahead of time for your patience and participation. I wanted to say that the lecture I'm going to give today is in part derived from a course that I do teach at Wellesley College on the history of propaganda and the history and dynamics of propaganda. I was able to co-curate an exhibition last year at the Davis Museum at Wellesley College with, at the time, my colleague at the Davis, Meredith Fluke, who's now a staff member here at the Museum of Fine Arts. We curated an exhibition called Artists Take Action, which was a collection of posters, protest posters, really from the 19th century until the present. And so part of what I'm going to do today is really reliant on what we did at the Davis Museum, bringing forth some of the material that we worked on. I also want to thank this museum for the exhibition, The Art of Influence. The postcard exhibition, I think, is extraordinary. It's small but highly focused. I know you've been really working through that in the last couple of classes that you've held together. And I also want to celebrate the book, The Propaganda Front, which is related to this, which is about the postcard collection, particularly because an ex-student of mine is one of the authors. Yay. So I wanted to say that I'm very tempted to talk about our present moment, but I will not, except to quote Toni Morrison, that at any given moment when there's a sense of collective outrage, artists always take action. And to talk about artists taking action in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s would take about 3 months standing here with all of us growing cobwebs to think about the variety of voices and approaches that artists took and intervene in the public sphere. So what I'm going to do is present a number of very targeted little case studies, which are more or less chronological. Most of them are of artists working within the U.S. Sometimes these collections of artists working within the U.S. are looking back at historical manifestations of protest art or are looking to other countries for ways of thinking about strategizing protests and resistance. So I'm going to look back and forth a little bit. And I'm going to focus on poster arts, ephemeral arts, because that became one of the cheapest and most readily available and chief forms of protest among a range of artists that we'll be viewing. I may stop the lecture at various moments to ask for your input because, of course, much of the material I'm going to be showing is material that's embedded in your memories and your experience, and you may have some very personal relationships to some of the material that I will be showing. And so I'd be very interested, I think we'd all be interested in hearing responses and anecdotes. It may be I'll stop in the middle, it may be I'll wait till the end, but I know that all of you at some point or another will have had an intimate relationship, one way or another, with some of this material. And if at any point you do feel the urge to say something, stop me and raise your hand or call out, because I do think some of this material is very intimate to probably many of you in the audience. So I want to talk about collectivism. I will be talking about poster arts. I want to talk about artists and others, some people who don't even think of themselves as artists, who produced work that we now think of as iconic of this time. Artists who took visual action, and I want to talk about visual action, with a conviction that the visual arts are crucial to the health and functioning of the public sphere, of a healthy society, and artists who speak truth to power, believing that the visual arts are crucial vehicles to healthy public discourse. I focus, as I said, largely on the US, but I'll be moving out a little bit. And before I start talking about the resistance art, I'm going to just reach back into what I know you already know and what you've already been studying. And so tell me to move on if this is, too much reaching back. But I wanted to, first of all, just think of where the artists that I want to talk about began, which is their own understanding of propaganda and how propaganda works. And I'm showing you the cover of Edward Bernay's study from 1928, one of the most influential sort of catalogers and theorists of propaganda in the interwar years, and also one of the most successful Madison Avenue advertisers, a nephew of Sigmund Freud. I'm sure you've been talking about his work and reading his work. Their heads shaking, yes? No. Okay, just very quickly then. So in the United States, propaganda is, ancient, right? Propagandizing ideas, supporting institutions, supporting governments, supporting colonial reach. It's as ancient as writing itself and as rhetoric itself. But in the United States, in the First World War, and this you have been studying, the Committee for Public Information was organized to try to bring us quickly into the war effort in 1917. And at the end of the war, a number of institutions were established to try to study the mechanisms of propaganda. And Edward Bernays, who is a Madison Avenue advertiser, wrote this slim little book on propaganda. And you've had a chance to read what's on the screen. I'm not going to read it out loud. I hate reading the PowerPoint that's right in front of you. But among the things that he said which were crucial was that for propaganda to be successful, you already know the ends that you have in mind, and you find any means possible to meet those ends. You want to move and mobilize a public using mass media in order to suit your will. And he talked about propaganda and the way that one moves a public both in the commercial realm, in advertising, and of course in the political realm, in terms of governments. In 1937, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis was established in New York, and at that time, both looking back at the First World War and the different informational strategies that were used by the engaged governments, among them the US CPI, as well as the rise of fascism internationally, moved a group of sociologists and psychologists to try to identify the essential strategies of propaganda. And I'm assuming that you've also looked at this as well, but I just want to remind us of what was understood to be the codification of propaganda techniques as put forward at Columbia University in 1937. So the name-calling, glittering generalities, transfer, testimonial, plain folks, card stacking, and bandwagon approaches. Again, I know this is all review. Name-calling, and there's examples of all of these different strategies by slightly different names in the exhibition. But name-calling is, making an enemy. Enemy formation is crucial to some forms of propaganda by identifying, as this World War I US poster does, Germany as this giant bloodthirsty ape carrying away Lady Liberty to have his way with her, carrying the club of Kultur that's covered with blood, and moving from a devastated Europe across the water onto the shores of the US. It's a way of mobilizing sentiment to get people to enlist in the US Army to fight against this monster, this non-human enemy. So name-calling is crucial to the function of enemy formation. Glittering generalities we're very familiar with, which is kind of a gross, large rhetoric, which is promising everything and saying nothing. That big, beautiful wall, for example, is a glittering generality. Transfer is a method in which you are appropriating something from one arena, bringing it into your own, appropriating it, adapting it, and making a linkage between your message and some other message. And in this case, Second World War, National Socialist advertising telling women that if they buy undergarments, they will become classical goddesses. further the eugenics effort of the National Socialist government. Testimonials, statistics, experts during the Cold War years, Mad Men. It's really good to smoke. More scientists and educators smoke Kent than other cigarette brands. So enlisting expertise as a way of obfuscating other kinds of messages so that one will actually believe in the statistics and the expertise and bow to the authority of a kind of knowledge that you yourself don't have. Plain folks, well, just speaking like everybody, dropping your G's and just making sure that you're not speaking down to, or seemingly not to speak down to, but speak up to your audience. Another familiar strategy. Card stacking, well, if you're just going to provide information that is unassailable, you're stacking the cards against any possibility of resisting a message, right? Statistics works, threats work, and finally the bandwagon approach. I think this is in the current exhibition. I can't remember, but it's another World War I poster in which you gotta join up. You gotta be one of the gang. You can't be left behind. And this particular poster by Laura Bry from 1917 asks whether you're going to be one of the masculine many on the outside of the window or whether you're going to be on the inside as a kind of a foppish, upper-class, distant enemy of the state. So all of these are strategies which were identified in the 1930s and which writers about propaganda since that time have used as standard strategies. And then as is beautifully laid out in the current exhibition, propaganda is multifaceted and it is enlisted throughout society, coordinating all media at one's disposal, including postcards. It's crucial that if for a successful propaganda campaign to exist, it has to exist over time so that messaging needs to be repeated. Through repetition naturalizes an idea. Again and again and again, no matter how alien the idea, it begins to be absorbed. If it's coming at you through all kinds of different media from all directions, you're swimming in it, you lose track of the fact that you're swimming in it over time. Propagandistic messages need to lack complexity. You can't stop and think, what did I just hear? What did I just see? Needs to be direct. There are overt and covert forms of propaganda. There is disinformation versus informational propaganda. And again, all that is so beautifully embodied in the exhibition in the next room, or the galleries across the way. And then finally, what's crucial for successful propaganda is to be able to appropriate, to act in the manner of appropriating pre-existing familiar ideas and twisting them slightly so that what you're offering already seems natural in some way to an audience, and you can pull an audience along. It is the confidence of this kind of propagandistic, multifocal strategy, the confidence of kind of propagandistic voices, and the masculinization of those propagandistic voices that were exercised by governments and institutions, particularly during the Cold War, that in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, during the Cold War, toward the end of the Cold War, that artists began to use the strategies of propagandists to the tools of the master to take down the master's house. In the 1980s, I'm just going to show you a couple of images, projects by artists whose work you already know. This one is in the Museum of Fine Arts collection. Artists, particularly feminist artists, who used propagandistic techniques or the languages or the structure of propaganda to unwrite or to resist propagandistic messages. Barbara Kruger, in this large-scale print, takes a photograph which looks like in the background, it could be one of a number of things if you look quickly. It looks like it's an act of violence, potentially. It is actually a, bachelor party, that was what I was, thank you, bachelor party. with this message that's been cut out and pasted on and then rephotographed. You construct intimate rituals which allow you to touch the skin of other men. From 1981, she was working for fashion magazines as a layout artist, and her night job, that was her day job, her night job was cutting apart the exact magazines that she was laying out and creating these messages which unwrote the kinds of advertising and propagandistic messages that she had been studying and that she wanted to take apart. So often her work is put forward to this unknown you and allows you. Sometimes she talks about the we, but one is never sure who one's talking about. She uses these linguistic shifters. So depending on the audience that's seeing it, they will receive it differently. But one of the things that her work intended to do is really to unmask the rituals of masculinity and power and control over women. She wrote, I work with pictures and words together because they have the ability to determine who we are and who we aren't. In other words, recognizing as an artist that words and images together are powerful weapons on what she saw as the political right, she enlisted them for her purposes on the left. And she's one of the architects of what begins to be understood as the sort of pictures generation of the late 1970s and 1980s, artists who work with texts and pictures to try to unwrite public messages. At the same time as her work began to have traction, the artist Jenny Holzer began to publish and produce what she called her truisms, and I'm showing you one of her most famous projects from 1985 in which she was able to get funding to project or program her messages into the LED light board on the New York Times building in Times Square, so that one walked into Times Square in the mid-1980s and there was, deodorant advertisements and advertisements for plays and underwear and everything else. And all of a sudden these messages which were disjunctive, which didn't have an end goal in mind, these open-ended messages which she called truisms. And I don't know if anybody ever experienced that strange dissociative moment of walking into Times Square and suddenly realizing, instead of being told what to do and told what to think, suddenly your thoughts are moving in directions that are strangely anti-message. She began by, as a student of art and of philosophy, began to think about language itself as works of art and began to compile lists of what she called these truisms, these statements that she posted around New York in phone booths and on walls and in other surprising areas that didn't seem to be art areas, non-art areas. So as you walked around the streets of New York in the late 70s or the early 80s, you just encounter these strange lists of what seemed to be demands at first, that seemed to be political messages at first, and are of a strange kind of politic, which asks you to think about your own value system. And of course, it's familiar to all of us because the Museum of Fine Arts has one of her moving light boards that has a series of sentences drawn from 7 of her projects in-house. These two artists, Barbara Kruger and Jenny Holzer, are among a number of artists working in the 1980s who recognized that in the previous decades there were artists who were acting to counterbalance or counteract binary messages coming from institutions. And they specifically wanted to work in what they identified as the public sphere. And here's another block of text with all apologies. In 1964, the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas published an essay on defining the public sphere, which for these two artists, Holzer and Kruger, kind of defined where they wanted to make interventions. The public sphere, as defined by Habermas, was this funny area between public life and private life, which was an arena where people just encountered one another all the time, where there was an opportunity, not in the home and not in an institution, but in the spaces of, undefined spaces of public confrontation, public discourse, where people could fashion their own ways of thinking and imagining, where they could come together as a mass movement, potentially, to fashion their ways of thinking. And he saw that the public sphere, what he called the public sphere, was a space, therefore, of freedom. Neither an institution, again, nor the confines of the home, but a place of cultural potential blending. In the public sphere, he identified that with public opinion itself. He said that the public sphere and the guarantee of the public sphere legitimized and offered the space for dissent. And this is important because it is within this arena of the public sphere, as he defined it in 1964, that his contemporaries, the artists who I want to show, were also acting and claiming space. One of the things that he noted, which is important as we go forward with the images I would love to share, is that he made the claim that the authorities, that institutions and governments unwittingly shape the public sphere and shape dissent by contributing to its rise. In other words, by policing public spaces, by offering covert propaganda in public spaces, and by even invoking the authority of the concept of, here's a public space for you, that by trying to demarcate and control public spaces, in fact, institutions and governments gave rise to dissent. So this idea of the public sphere, a space between a strict institutional framework and a domestic framework, everything in between, was also the space for propaganda, as you've been studying it, right? Where postcards are sent back and forth, for example, or cigarette cards are collected from newsstands. So it's within that space that the next series of the case studies I'd like to offer very specifically took place. How many of you remember this? Okay, talk about it. I mean, seriously, take a moment. Anecdotes. Any anecdotes? No anecdotes. Okay, hands, but no anecdotes. Fine. So this was one of the most widely distributed images in the mid-1960s for a sort of an anti-war message. It was produced by Lorraine Schneider, who first entered into an art and design contest at the Pratt Art Institute in New York. She won a little prize. And this design with this, kind of childlike flower and this childlike writing, this little poster, was then adapted by a number of organizations, one of which, and the most important one, was Another Mother for Peace, that then began to distribute this not just as a poster, not just as postcards, but as jewelry and as, it's among the first of the T-shirt designs that began to be, you could wear your protest. It appeared in a number of forms, widely distributed in the mid-1960s. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think most of the hands that went up were women. Okay, sorry. And some men, I'm sorry. Okay, yes?
It also comes on the heels of LBJ's campaign against Goldwater, in which he depicts a young girl in the field holding the flower, and the image, of course, of the atomic bomb going off at the end.
With the countdown, that advertisement,
So that creates space, if you will, for something like this.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And I don't think that Lorraine Schneider made that particular association, but that's fantastic as a frame for this, right? This terrible Cold War threatening commercial, right? So this was one way in the mid-1960s that war protesters, peace advocates, began to use imagery using the same channels that that institutional propagandists had made available and made clear over the course of the earlier part of the 20th century. In other words, enlisting every single aspect of mass media as well as intimate apparel that would reflect and mirror a message over time and throughout culture. One of the standards of propaganda success, as first defined by Edward Bernays in the 20s and then in the 30s, and then used forward. Another strategy was that embraced by the Black Panther movement. And it's to Emory Douglas that I would like to turn for a few minutes, who was a young artist living in Oakland in the 1960s. He had first been arrested at the age of 13 and was in a facility for adolescents for a period of time. And at that facility, he had been introduced to printmaking. And he showed some talent, so somebody suggested that he go on to design college, which is what he did, and became a graphic designer. And he said that it was through the carceral system and then through his basic education that he learned both to make images and disseminate images, but he learned how to put newspapers together. He learned how to lay type. And for that reason, when he connected with Bobby Seale and Eldridge Cleaver, he was brought in to publish the Black Panther community news. And so he became the Minister of Culture for the Black Panthers. And it was he who published, along with his partners, a weekly newspaper. Initially, it had a very small circulation, but by the height of the newspaper, they were printing about 500,000 copies and disseminating them. And what he did was often both held the cover and also illustrated throughout the newspaper. And the covers have become iconic. And this one is both a rendering that he did, a painting that he did, and then also a series of collaged images. And of course, with this weeping soldier, this is one of his most iconic images, a male, African-American male soldier weeping, protesting the fact that, as he said, and the newspaper continued, their fight wasn't in Vietnam, but their fight was right here in the US, but a disproportionate number of GIs were, of course, people of color and people without economic advantages. So his images ran throughout the course of the Black Panther magazine. As I said, he was known as the Minister of Culture for the Black Panthers, and very often in the newspaper, he would include posters. So he would print posters, which were folded in half and part of the distribution so that people receiving the newspaper could then take the posters and have those available to share or to post on their own walls or to post on city walls. And they were all, many of them, they all held the Black Panther logo at the bottom, and then the revolutionary art by the Minister of Culture, Emery Davis. Davis continued with his critical interventions into the war in Vietnam, into election campaigns, into the lives of Americans, calling out disparities in terms of class and in terms of ethnicity throughout. And again, his are among the most iconic of the representations of the 1960s in terms of a kind of a revolutionary gesture and revolutionary language. So on the one hand, there's the flower, another mother for peace, and on the other hand, there's the fist in the air. And then there's 1970. And I want to focus on the year 1970 for a little while now with a couple of other sort of iconic images and iconic campaigns, Emery among them. So after the horrible year of 1968 with the assassinations, and in April of 1970 with Richard Nixon on television announcing that there was going to be a slight expansion of the war in Vietnam into Cambodia, and then the campus reactions across the United States, and then the Kent State murders, campuses erupted across the United States. And here's where I want to stop for a moment and ask, I'm guessing some people in this room were at university in 1970. I'm guessing. And I'm guessing maybe you were at universities that had reactions to these events. And I'm wondering if there's a word or two you want to offer to the group about that. or not. Thank you.
I was a strike coordinator at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
Can everybody in the back hear, by the way?
No, I was the strike coordinator at the Harvard Graduate School of Education at that time. And prior to that, I'm a former civil rights worker. So this is my time. And now I've proceeded to move forward. But I was down in Mississippi at that time.
So it's intimate, I'm sure, to many of you in the room, right? I remember these events too as a kid, but as the daughter of civil rights workers. So intimate to, but me looking over the counter, but you were there, very present. The fist and the peace symbol together. How does one begin to make sense out of what's happening in our own government, what's happening in our own country, what's happening in an undeclared war, and so on? A number of artists, I'm going to focus on Oakland and San Francisco for a few minutes. There was a great deal of support across the United States for students to try to funnel their anger and their confusion into action. And that action often took place in inexpensive means in printmaking studios. So printmaking studios across the United States, particularly at university campuses, began to open for anyone who wanted to come in and design a poster, anyone who wanted to make something visual that could be put up on walls, that could be put up in dormitories, that could be held in demonstrations. So some of what I'm going to show you now it's ephemera, and this isn't museum collection material, but it's more archival material, but again, probably familiar to many of you as well. An art student at Foothill College in California was invited into a printmaking studio in 1970 and created this image. He said that he was struck by the raised fist of the revolutionary arts, for example, the history of unionism and the history of even affected by the Black Panthers iconography, and at the same time very moved by the peace symbol, by the notion of in a way, the flower. And so he put this together sort of on a whim, and he then reported that some people from Stanford University came by the printmaking studio to see what was up, and they kind of reached into this one as a kind of an emblem for their own student movement. It then was adapted by the California Students Offensive, and then the National Student Congress, and then by a progressive party in the city of Berkeley. And pretty soon in 1970, this became kind of a national emblem of an anti-war movement. So it's both the fist and in a sense, and the flower. In May of 1970, a group of faculty members from Berkeley and a group of students, was anybody here at Berkeley? Were you part of this? Did you know about this? Can you, okay, I'm going to show a few of these, and maybe, again, if you don't mind with an anecdote, just share what you know. For me, this is history. For you, this is your life, right? But a group of students and professors at Berkeley and others from the community collected together for a brief period of time and began to create posters in the architecture building at the University of California at Berkeley. And I think and they worked collectively, so many of the posters actually don't have names attached to them because the idea was that it was a collective and nobody's voice was going to overwhelm anyone else's voice in this effort. They used, I think you can see that this is, do you remember old-fashioned printer paper? Right, when printers had sprockets. So this collective of artists, of young people, a lot of them young people who had never made art in a serious way before, used printer paper, which itself was kind of a political statement because it came out of the institutional informational systems, and they used cardboard. They used only recycled materials for their work, and formed the Berkeley Political Poster Workshop. Some of the works out of the workshop have become iconic of the Vietnam effort by students, including this one, in which the inverted American flag holds not all the right stripes and not all the right stars, but of course weaponry in place of the stars and the stripes. And an inverted flag is one that this particular student chose to use because it's an SOS signal within the military to have an upside-down flag. So it's using a military language as a way of critiquing the military itself. So all of these thoughtful strategies were arranged through collective action, through this notion of this public sphere, this place where people congregated and shared ideas and helped each other to arrive at their work. And I'm just showing you a photograph of students having freshly printed some posters. Here's one, and hanging them up on a clothesline. So it's all bootstrap material. This was organized by a very well-known printmaker in the San Francisco area who was a member of a kind of a Latina collective and informational system in San Francisco, and who is known for these, graphic elements. This is a slightly later poster of Montoya, but particularly his very sort of characteristically playful use of letter forms. So he became a facilitator for the workshop. He didn't identify himself as a teacher. He wasn't identified as a leader in any way, but there he was offering technical advice and some strategic help for the members of the workshop. The material that was made in the workshop, and again, you can see all the sprockets from the printer paper, it's not, I guess a lot of people wouldn't call this great art as art, but it is art as action. And this was crucial both to this workshop and then the other workshops around the US that were enabling young people to find a voice and then make their voices visible, with the understanding that visible voices can lead to some sort of action. It's different from propaganda per se because there's no fixed result that was going to be offered to the individual looking at these posters, but a range of choices that one might have involving the war effort. Okay, what would you like to?
The top left one was part of a boycott shooting lecture campaign. And it was, as you said, something which was produced in order to advance an activity or actions which were taking place at that time. And the large focus of the anti-war movement was GE.
So there were calls for divestment, there were calls for boycotts, there were calls for nothing other than to recognize that withdrawal was the only way that one might honorably act as a government. So there's GE that's being indicted there. And then the students themselves at Berkeley and in Oakland and in other sites around the US were also given some impetus in the work they were doing from the Atelier Populaire in Paris in 1968, the student riots, the student rebellions in the city of Paris, and then the brutal put down of the rebellions in that city in 1968 gave rise to a massive effort of poster production, likewise by a collective of young people with workshops available to them who made sort of poster after poster, very few of them with any artistic training at all, but all of them with a sense of outrage and with a desire to make their work, such as this representation of a French gendarme, with the SS pattern across a shield, again, sort of speaking as the individual against a powerful authority. This workshop in Paris in 1968 was one of the models for the collectivism of the US workshops in the 70s, and another very important one, and one of the most important political action workshops anywhere in the world in the interwar years. Was the Taller de Gráfica Populaire in Mexico City, which was founded in 1937 by a group of printmakers. I don't know if you studied this also in this course? No. So In 1937, a group of artists working in Mexico City, many of whom were associated with, who had been part of the revolution in the 1920s and who were members of the Communist Party and who were profound anti-fascist theorists and actors, gathered together with this understanding that visual images are the most direct way of informing people, particularly people in Mexico who may not have a high level of education. And they collectivized, they began to meet every Friday in a printmaking workshop in Mexico City. Leopoldo Mendez was one of the organizers of the workshop. And every Friday they would get to work, and they had lithographic stones that they would wipe off every week and then make new lithographs, and then at night put posters up all over the city, topical, whatever was happening that week. And then the police would tear them down and they'd put more posters up, and they'd be torn down and they'd put more posters up. And so this is what they did. They viewed themselves as graphic guerrillas. And they began to amass a larger and larger and larger group of artists who were participating. The artists almost never identified themselves by autograph, by name. And it's understood that they would bring an idea to the group, or they'd make a lithograph, and somebody would say, wow, that face looks kind of weird, let me help you with that. So even the individual images were often collectively done. So not one authorial voice, but a collective, which was part of their ethos. And it was out of that group that one of the first images ever produced by an artist of the deportations to concentration camps in Germany was produced. This group, this one, Deportation to Death, which is actually owned by the Museum of Fine Arts, is a representation of the stories that a lot of the German emigres, or immigrants into Mexico, were participating in the workshop and were telling the artists. In 1939, another member of the workshop had produced this poster, and again, it was ephemeral. The works that they produced were ephemeral. This was made on newsprint, or very cheap paper. 1st of May, 1939, a Republican Spain had fallen to the fascists. Czechoslovakia had ceased to exist. And so Workers' Day, 1939, the hands of workers, the kind of slightly brutalized hands, are holding up the globe almost as though it's a baby, like cushioning it at the bottom, holding it over a sequence of horrifically sharp forms of weaponry, and there's a little Nazi tank down below. So it's warning that the salvation of the world is in your hands, so it's again addressed to you. And it's using the strategy of institutional propaganda to try to rally support for the Communist Party, to march on Workers' Day to be resisting fascism. These posters, these ephemeral posters, the notion of a collective in which not a single artist would necessarily offer her or his own authorship, included the American artist Elizabeth Catlett, who had moved from the US to Mexico to join this collective and was for years a part of the TGP. And this is actually another print that's owned by the Museum of Fine Arts. And one of the things that she testified to as a member of the TGP is that as an African-American woman, as a woman of color, she couldn't find a foothold in 1950s America, but she found a place where she actually could have a voice in Mexico. So the mutability of the prints from Mexico into the US, the popularity and the fame of this particular workshop gave impetus then to the American students at Berkeley and elsewhere in 1970 to think about collective action and to think about a lack of authorship and to think about producing quickly and cheaply so these things could be put up. And of course, sometimes the political poster workshop participants use the kind of enemy formation that we've seen sort of classic propaganda using, right? Fascists as rats. This is nothing new, with an American flag and a dollar sign so that the government, the sort of military and government become parts of the enemy. One of the most iconic images that then has been claimed for authorship that came out of the workshop is this one, America is Devouring Its Children, also printed in the spring of 1970. And of course, it is appropriating and a very recognizable painting by Francisco Goya of Saturn devouring his children from the 1820s. And the appropriation would be recognizable to an educated person. This understanding is that it's reaching back into the horrors of the early 19th century and the Napoleonic War and the post-Napoleonic period, and then so doubly loading this particular message. And the message had everything to do, in the end, with, as the author said, with the massacre at Kent State, and then the Pulitzer Prize. Later said that the poster could be related to the massacre at Kent State, and it was at that point that he took ownership for the image, so that it became an icon not just of the war and not just of America, with a K, like Kafka's America, but became kind of an icon for the entire student movement. In 1970, as the posters were being produced, Berkeley, the university, held an exhibition, Posters for Peace, and a number of the posters were then curated by an art historian named Herschel Chipp, who then had this to say about it, and tried to explain why posters were so important to resistance efforts. They're quick, they're inexpensive, they can be made by anyone. If you're making a silkscreen, right, a silkscreen print, you can wipe the image off the screen and make a new one in no time at all. You can wipe an image off a lithographic stone. With silkscreen, you don't need a lot of training to make a print. You just need some solvent and an X-Acto knife. And so this is what Herschel Chipp, attempted to explain in an art exhibition that would then take the political poster workshop and raise it to the effort of, raise it to the level of museum display. At the same moment, turning to New York City, another group, collective of artists, began to realize that they, as a collective, could begin to take action as institutional rebels. And the Art Workers Coalition was formed by a large group of artists and art critics in New York. One of them was Faith Ringgold, who made this poster to demonstrate our strength at MoMA. They began to organize marches and protests at New York City museums that they thought were exclusive in a host of ways. And also in 1969, Ringgold and others presented the Museum of Modern Art, or presented to Bates Lowry, the director of the Museum of Modern Art, a group of demands that the group held. That there were so few women, there were no women represented at the museum. There were no artists of color represented in the collections of the museum. That living artists were excluded from certain kinds of participation in the museum. That the museums were charging for admission, and artists shouldn't have to pay, and students shouldn't have to pay. So they demanded a free day every single week. They demanded that artists hold their own copyright, and living artists should own and be responsible for their own materials, and so on. The Museum of Modern Art collaborated to some degree with the Art Workers Coalition, figuring that it's better to accede to some of their demands than to be that institution that was going to, as the artist said, destroy the life of artists per se. And the artists wanted the museums to separate themselves from the war in Vietnam and demanded a moratorium on, among the boards of trustees in the war effort. And as a result of that, several museums in New York in 1970 held a day of silence, the Museum of Modern Art being one of them. But these were small gestures toward their larger demands. And then in 1970, the Art Workers Coalition engaged in another project, which is another one of these iconic images from 1970. There's the workshop on the West Coast, there are workshops all over the country, and then there's this event that took place at the Museum of Modern Art. And I'm guessing many of you recognize what this is, and I wonder if anybody wants to speak to it. Everybody recognize this? Pardon? the My Lai massacre. It's a photograph that was released of the My Lai massacre. So it's a poster that was created by a collective of artists and made as a color lithograph. And it's obviously an anti-war image, and I'll show a little bit of background in a moment. But initially, the Museum of Modern Art agreed to help to fund this poster and offered the resources for the production of the poster and the materials for a four-color separation image. And then, so the poster began to be printed. So it's an image that was taken by the military photographer Ronald Haverly, who was embedded with the troops in Vietnam, and I'll show another image in a moment. And with the words Q, there's question and babies, answer and babies down below. Haverly had been with Charlie Company and troops from Charlie Company when they landed in near My Lai, and many of you remember this. I remember it as a very young person. Many of you remember it as older people, and the horror of the revelation of what our own troops had done in the way of annihilating a village full of innocents, right? Or at the time understood to be innocents, old men, women, children, and babies. Haverly had 2 cameras with him as he entered into My Lai, and one was a black and white film camera of 36 images on a roll that was the official military camera, and he took pictures of the troops as they were engaged in some of their activities, burning the village. And he had his own camera with him with color film in it, and at one moment when he realized that the troops were going to kill off everyone in the village, he took his own camera out and started taking photographs that he then held on to for a period of time. But in late 1969, he brought them to the Cleveland Plain dealer, his hometown, and he felt that they needed to be seen. And he talked with a journalist there, and so they were first published. They then very quickly entered into national consciousness when they were published in Life magazine in full color. And then the New York Times and the New Yorker and other magazines and newspapers of record began to unfold the fact that this massacre had occurred from between 300 to 500 people. And there had been a cover-up. It hadn't been announced to the public. So this was the public rollout via Haverly's photographs. Mike Wallace interviewed a member of Charlie Company in 1969, and this is what some of you may remember also having witnessed this, when Mike Wallace is trying to understand from a member of Charlie Company what happened, how many did you kill, etc. And in the interview, the final piece of the interview was trying to understand, you killed men, women, and children? Yes, men, women, and children. And babies? And babies. And the end of the interview, the horror of this annihilation of the innocent, massacre of the innocents, impelled the Art Workers Coalition, in fact, to make this poster and then to quote the interview on the surface of it. In turn, they had made an arrangement with the Museum of Modern Art to exhibit the work and to be able to have this be an official production of the Museum of Modern Art, but MoMA pulled out partway through the production. And instead, the Art Workers Coalition held a demonstration in front of Picasso's 1937 painting Guernica, which was at the time held by the Museum of Modern Art. The painting was not going to be returned to Spain until after Franco's death. And of course, Guernica is one of the great historical representations of resistance and of sort of anti-fascist, the language of anti-fascism. So the Art Workers Coalition amassed in front of Guernica, held up their poster, and started giving them away. And like good propagandists, decided that their posters should become part of an anti-war effort, and they began to publish black and white versions of it of them and send them out so that they would be included in newspapers and magazines around the country. And this is just a black and white version. There's a fold in the middle, so it had been embedded in a newspaper. This is from the Oakland Public Library collection. Jumping to the 80s, and sort of, I'm going to end in about 15 minutes, and then we'll have more conversation. So 1970 is a key year for the production of visual arts, and particularly for printmaking, and the understanding that printmaking, whether by the Art Workers Coalition, which then became part of a manifestation, or part of student protests, that posters were integral to the vocalization of resistance, again, in the public sphere. And all of these organizers understood that their work was going to be most effective if it was distributed in many different cultural sites simultaneously and over time, which was the strategy of propaganda, which became the strategy of resistance. The organization Grand Fury, which was both a gay advocacy organization but also an AIDS activist organization, began a postering campaign and an art installation campaign and a performance campaign in the 1980s. And these are three of the posters that they produced, which were installed all over New York City. So you could go to a bus stop, and particularly the Read My Lips campaign was all over New York, in which men kissed men, women kissed women, men kissed women, people coded as interracial kissed one another. And the idea is, of course, to normalize love. And at the same time, all over the city were posters, and then this became a national campaign as well, indicting the US government for not putting money into AIDS research, and in fact ignoring AIDS research and demonizing people who had HIV/AIDS. So this was a kind of a multi-directional both postering and advertising campaign that Grand Fury sponsored. Grand Fury took its name from the Plymouth Grand Fury, which was the police car of choice in the 1980s, so appropriating a title using, again, the sort of the tools of the master's house against itself. Grand Fury partnered with the group ACT UP and began to be its sort of propaganda arm, its visual arm. And this is, I'm sure that this is a poster and an image that's familiar to everyone. In here, the adaptation of appropriation of the pink triangle, first from Nazi concentration camps in which gay men were, everybody had a triangle if you were an enemy of the state, and the pink triangle was a signal of a prisoner who was gay. And instead of an image of shame and destruction, it began to be used as a symbol of pride and resistance, with a constant message that silence equals death, not to speak of HIV/AIDS, not to allow for it, not to subsidize research was to kill a population. One of the most sort of charming of the propagandists for ACT UP and for Grand Fury was the artist Keith Haring. And I'm showing one of his posters that also populated New York and then elsewhere in 1989, and inciting people to act up to fight AIDS. So it's in a sense a propaganda poster because the notion was to take some sort of action, but the kind of action one should take is undefined. Haring, of course, had become famous in the late 70s and particularly the early 1980s as a kind of a subway bandit when in New York City subways, between moments of advertisement being put up on these advertising boards in the subways, when there was black paper that was put down between ads, Haring would attack the paper with white chalk and create these, delightful kind of world of figures that then began to populate his posters on behalf of Grand Fury, always with ignorance equaling fear and silence equaling death. The posters had, with sort of X marks the spot, were often, sort of charming in a way and playful in a way, and so kind of pulled you in with their kind of, it's like the flower and the fist simultaneously, until you realize that, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, are embedded in the three figures, and all of them marked with this pink X. So the 80s, reaching back to the postering techniques of earlier generations and this notion of collective action, also gave rise to the group, the Guerrilla Girls, and it's that on the handout that I gave you, of course, is one of their most famous posters. So the Guerrilla Girls are alive and well and living in New York. Their address is on every one of their posters, so you can always reach out to them now if you choose to. But they began by attacking, doing institutional critique, not unlike Barbara Kruger, not unlike Jenny Holzer, not unlike the Art Workers Coalition. They travel around as a group. They are anonymous. They're artists and they're critics and art historians who in 1985 did this count, very straightforward, of how many women had one-person exhibitions in New York in 1984, 1 at the Modern, 0 elsewhere. And their notion was to provide data. It's that one of the standard techniques of propaganda, right, is to offer this expertise. So their first couple of assaults on the museum and gallery world were text only. And this is one that everybody can really appreciate, that one of the advantages of being a woman artist is not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits. I mean, this is when the art market, of course, was booming in the 80s, just exploding in the field of contemporary art. And it's great to have more time to work after your mate dumps you for someone younger, et cetera. And one of the greatest parts of being a woman artist was getting your picture in art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. The Guerrilla Girls only are active when they're wearing gorilla heads, so they're unidentifiable as individuals, but they're there as a group. Each one of them wears the name of another artist, so Frida Kahlo is part of the group, Georgia O'Keeffe is part of the group. And you can find them all over the place. This particular one its charms are endless. They went to the Metropolitan Museum in 1989, and they did in their memoirs. They say that they did a weenie count at the Museum of Modern Art to see, looking at representations of men, representations of women, who the artists were who made the men, who the artists were who made the women, recognized no women were making images of women that were up at the Met. And so they came forth with more data. And this time, in this poster, it's significant because instead of just text, of course, they include this image, which is an appropriated and modified representation of Ingres' famous 1814 painting La Grande Odalisque, a representation of a sleek, magnificent, light-skinned woman in a harem setting, suggestively holding a feathered fan up above her crotch and wearing a gorilla head. So they turned this this evocation of exotic sexuality into kind of a monstrous self-image. Originally, they had received money from the Public Art Fund in New York City to create this poster for the sides of buses, New York City buses. And then the bus company reneged. And then the money was pulled. I can't imagine why. And then they got private funding, and they started putting the posters up they rented space on the buses anyway. And then the bus company pulled out. New York City MTA, no. So they then made them in small scale and just posted them all over New York, wherever they possibly could. And so now they exist. They're highly collectible, existing in museum locations. One more look sideways. As they were collectivizing and as they were creating their feminist interventions into the New York art world, and then increasingly interventions around racism as well as sexism in the New York, and then the world art worlds internationally. They looked to London, to one final collective group that I'd like to mention, which was the See Red Women's Workshop. Has anybody had intersections with them at all? It's another collective of women in the mid-1970s that started fighting against the National Front, the far right-wing anti-immigration party that had been formed in London and was gaining some sort of a threshold of power in the 1970s. So this is like pre-anti-Brexit protests before avant la lettre. In 1974, they organized and they began to produce posters. And much like the students at Berkeley in 1970, many of the women making these posters were not trained artists at all. They were facilitated by a small group of artists who helped them to make screen prints. And then they posted their work all over London so that it would be part of the debate, it would be part of a conversation in the public sphere. And I guess that's the thing that I would like to close with. I have one more poster to show and then a conversation to have, is that the artists that I'm showing, the artists that I've chosen to show, and the artists who were successful and became iconic in the work that they produced, had as their goal a public conversation, and not to impel any particular action, but to be part of a large, messy dialogue that would be educational. And I'm just showing you in Paris a photograph from International Women's Day, which the See Red Women's Collective was part of, which the Guerrilla Girls were part of, which is an international phenomenon, to offer their works as part of education and thought exercise. And this is the final one I would like to show, because I just can't not. Esther Hernandez is an artist who lives on the West Coast. She's still active as an artist, and she studied at Berkeley. She was a student at Berkeley. She came from a family of agricultural workers in the San Joaquin Valley. And she went full freight to Berkeley. And as she was visiting her home at one point, she told the story of visiting her mother while her mother was madly boiling water on the stove. And her question was, why are you boiling water? What are you going to do with that water? And the mother explained that there was so much, there were so many insecticides, and the water was so tainted that they had to boil it before use, which of course wouldn't do anything for the insecticides, but seemed like a safety measure. And Hernandez began to do her own research into insecticide use in the San Joaquin Valley, and then made this poster as a sort of indictment of agribusiness. And I'm sure you can read it all the way from the back, but of course it says, sun-mad raisins unnaturally grown with insecticides, miticides, herbicides, and fungicides. And of course, it is an appropriation of a well-known commercial package for sun-made raisins, which Hernandez also comments on, which is a mystification of labor, because in the original package, it shows a woman, sort of nicely dressed, nice white linen blouse, who's holding up a big tray of grapes right below her breast, which, if anybody's ever done any agricultural work, it just doesn't look. That's not how it looks. It's not how it works. And had she held that tray long enough, it would have either fallen down on her feet or she'd end up with a ruptured disc. So this has nothing to do with labor, but everything to do with selling product through female sexuality. So that's one of the things that Hernandez is commenting on. And then the bigger question is the way in which agricultural workers are subjected to the endless assaults of pesticides for underpaid labor. She produced this poster. It was actually an art poster, so she put it in exhibitions. I mean, she began to be a practicing artist. It did intervene in public spaces in the Valley. And then in 2008, just to say, she then revisited her own Sun Mad poster and revised it for current use. So now it is Sun Raid raisins, guaranteed deportation, Mixtecos, Zapotecos, byproduct of NAFTA. So she's still at it, she's still revising and considering how an image might migrate over time and how it might have an effect in the larger public conversation over time. Unnaturally harvested. So these are all, each of the ones that I've chosen have kind of risen through time and through collections and through writing as iconic of their moments and of their actions. Almost all of them were members of collectives, the artists who produced these, or are anonymous artists who produced these. And I should mention that Esther Hernandez is part of a collective of women muralists in the Bay Area, a group of women who began to paint murals in the 70s and the 80s without taking authorship, but taking claim to a women's collective. They all engaged in poster art. They all believed in visual activism against the singular propagandizing messages of institutions. They believed in collectivism, and they all believed in one way or another they were beating propaganda at its own game by adapting strategies and unmasking them. And I just have to end with one more poster because I can't not. Also, from 1972, and I am, it's great, right? I chose not to show this one, but if anybody later wants to look up a poster by Deborah Cass, K-A-S-S, from 2016, I'd invite you to do that as well, a reworking of Warhol. So thank you. Let's have a conversation, and maybe the light's up a little bit so we can see one another. Thank you for those of you who spoke during the presentation. Questions, comments, additions, corrections? I think there are, microphones that are coming down the aisles.
Could you comment on where you would place Corita Kent's work?
Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry. I cut her out of this because of just time. But Corita Kent, both as an image maker and an educator, was enormously influential in all of these efforts as well. And as an educator, she asked her students to be conscious of every single element of their environments and to try to amplify their environments in their work in the form of both protest and affirmation. She herself, in her own work, was very elaborate in much of her design work and much of the commentary that she produced layer after layer after layer in some of her images. But as a design theorist and as a teacher, her work bled into almost all of this, particularly on the West Coast. The exhibition that was at Harvard, was it here or Harvard? Harvard 2 years ago. Also, I think, was incredible in sort of revealing the ways in which, with enormous modesty, she put forward the works of collective action as part of a public dialogue. Is there anything you wanted to say in particular about her work? I just wondered where you would place it. Yeah, I was putting it was, sort of right there. It was right there with the Berkeley kids, and then I just knew that I just cut out things my heart wanted in there, so. Yes.
I wonder how much work you've done on the political work of Ben Shahn.
A lot. Yeah, when I teach my propaganda course in anti-propaganda, Ben Shahn is always part of the picture. Both his earlier works, and particularly his Sacco and Vanzetti mural, is one that I really focus on with the students. But then also going forward, and again, it's a matter of time, I decided to throw Mexicans in there instead of Shahn, and also some members of the WPA, developed a kind of a form language and a desire that image and text should work together as educational tools with very straightforward messages in order to undermine public institutional authority and governmental authority. So it's all the ones I cut out. But they're endless. I mean, it's endless. How about New Yorker covers? How about New Yorker covers? Well, that's a whole other topic, but that's fascinating. And I'd say there have always been very subversive covers. I would say the last decade has offered us. I guess we all cut them out and hold on to them. They're hugely important. With sadly, preaching to the converted, in a way, right? Do you have a microphone?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much. It was very informative. Part of the effectiveness I found was that this was at a time when, and sort of follows up in your last comment, when public space was sort of more singular and unified. How effective can this kind of work be now when there's more, I would say, multiple public spaces?
Yeah, doesn't this seem naive now? Because it was essentially, the whole notion of public space is now exploded, right? And digital theorists now, as you're asking and you're saying, recognize that there are so many multiple spaces that this is no longer effective. I mean, this was of its time in the 80s, and posters, we had a belief in them. And public space, television, conversations were much more unitary. So now with the capacity for every single one of us to curate our own realities, I'm holding my hand up as an invisible phone, and the data mining that goes into the creation of how we understand ourselves in relation to the world, it's a new world that's opened up, and there's so little control, right? So there's no longer any possibility of any univocal messaging. There's now a campaign for consciousness in a way that I think we're all still trying to understand. If you've got any insights into that, that would be very helpful. Because this now seems so naive, right? It's so sweet. Assaults on the Museum of Modern Art, and where we are now is just, it's, I think, continuing to be incomprehensible to most of us, unless you're the master, any one of the master programmers enabling messages to be individually operative. That's the best way I can understand contemporary propaganda, which is now changing literally by the month, right? The techniques. But I'm sure somebody out there has better insights into that than I do. Do you have a microphone?
Yeah.
You do.
A number of your, the second part of your presentation, a number of the posters had to do with women's resistance. And it strikes me that we're going through another very significant period of women reacting against sexual assault. And I haven't seen this type of artistic reaction, but there are people who are symbols of the reaction. For example, the national figures like people in the news media, the president, and so forth. And I'm just wondering if they are, in some sense, a substitute for the kind of art that was part of your presentation for the 80s.
Mm-hmm. So I chose to stay in the 80s, 60s and the 80s, and not speak of contemporary. I don't know if somebody else is going to be coming in and doing that, because it's very divisive. But the Black Lives Matter movement and the hashtag, the Me Too movement, have a vast amount of visual material associated with them. And what's so interesting is that the posters that are being produced are parts of demonstrations and are up on walls, and they're still at this ephemeral moment, and they're all over the internet. And I guess they'll be collectibles ever so soon. They're already starting to be. But so this is still out there, using both traditional materials and alternate pathways. And I guess everybody's familiar with the Shepherd Ferry posters that were produced for the Women's March, as well as others. But those are because those were just permeating marches nationally in January of 2017. So there's a lot of visual cultural material that's out there, some of it made by collectives, some made by individuals. It would be another topic, but I would think that the more univocal propagandistic voices that you're referring to, are from what we might call leadership. But it's out there. It's just terrific if you start Googling to see what's creatively there. And actually, a lot of contemporary poster making, looking back at the iconography of the 60s and of the 70s, and going even further back into the 30s and into the First World War as a way of revitalizing older messages, giving them new strengths, and therefore both reaching back and commenting on the contemporary moment.
It seems to me that a lot of the left-wing means of speaking out was visual. And as you get perhaps later into the 80s and 90s, a lot of the right-wing means of speaking out was talk radio. My premise may be false here, but why do you think one group went one way and the other went the other way? And I'm not aware of a lot of visual right-wing propaganda other than militaristic propaganda. Right-wing talk radio has been very successful, and left-wing talk radio has, for the most part, failed.
Yeah. I would say, I guess this is my bias to show left-wing resistance materials. I think, again, if we start to look, and if you do look, there's a tremendous amount of visual material coming from the right. I just didn't choose it now. As there was, like the NRA, I would say, okay, maybe it's not a right-wing organization, I'm sorry, but even going, pardon? It has become that. So, but over time, looking at material produced by the NRA, produced by, I won't say the Republican Party in its older manifestation was entirely right-wing, but there it's become, or part of it. Sorry, I don't know who's in the audience, but my bias, I've got a bias. But there's a tremendous amount of visual material out there, and there's a lot of really horrific material, enemy formation material, deforming material put out by skinhead organizations and far right wingers. And if you're a member of, for example, the Southern Poverty Law Center, you can see all that stuff. They consolidate it for our, so that we know what's out there. But there's a tremendous amount. It is in a more contained arena than the right-wing material. But it's always been out there. And it's really strong right now. And maybe that's something that should be a lecture, too, to understand the dynamics of that. A lot of it is also even quoting from some of this left-wing stuff and turning it on its head. But it's there.
Thank you. It was good to revisit a period of my life which felt more comfortable. You laid out, excuse me, after you introduced Edward Renee, you laid out this several strategies associated with propaganda. And of course, I couldn't help but reflect on the fact that the occupant of the White House seems to have identified each of these and incorporated them into his political approach. And I'm wondering if there's a way to look backward in history and examine other presidencies and other leaders and how well they incorporate this approach, because I think the current occupant is rather brilliant in this way to incorporate and appropriate this stuff. Sorry.
So there's a book that was published in 1920 by George Creel, who is the director of the Committee for Public Information, the CPI. He was hired by Woodrow Wilson to coordinate all media in the U.S. to bring us into the war in 1917. Wilson, this is going to answer your question, I think. Wilson ran on the platform that he would not bring us into the war, and then in the winter of 17 did a turnaround and needed to bring America with him. So George Creel was a very successful Madison Avenue advertiser, brought into Washington and created the CPI, which very quickly he understood that you need to rein in, coordinate messaging, like every single week, coordinate messaging. And so he commissioned films, he commissioned posters, he commissioned things to manifestations at county fairs, published sheet music. Every single week there was a new message that had to be coordinated. Helped, and I'm getting there. I promise I'm getting there. And this was part of what you probably studied from World War I too, right? And even commissioned informational films, news footage of the fight in France that was actually filmed in New Jersey, which was sent out to theaters nationally. And he also hired people called one-minute men who were given a speech, volunteers who were given a 1-minute speech, and they'd stand up in libraries and in schools and any manifestation, and they'd read a 1-minute message that was put out by the government every single week. It was unbelievably coordinated. And in 1920, Creel published a book called How We Advertised America, in which he laid out every single one of his strategies, how to rein in culture. What the Germans later called Gleichschaltung during the Second World War, when Goebbels became the Minister of Public Information, Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And it was on the basis of Creel's book that almost every single successful governmental propaganda campaign over the next part of the 20th century was organized. And so I would say that read the book, because it is the playbook of anyone who wants to rein in opinion and mobilize opinion using the mass media for a particular end. And I would agree with you that the current occupant of the White House and his staff have an unbelievable handle and adaptation of that, because Creel couldn't have known about the internet, but the constant adaptation of this notion of coordination, absolutely. LBJ, Kennedy, Eisenhower, all the way going back, had this as a playbook for different kinds of purposes. I don't know, it's a rant, but it's a good book. I think you can even get a PDF online. I think we're at time, but if there's any other commentary you have, I'd be really happy to speak with you in the front. Thank you.